the problem that I see a lot of people fall into is the whole time you're just taking orders and, hey, I need you to build this report. I need you to build this dashboard. I need you to do this thing. And you don't then pause to ask, why are we doing this? Is there a better way to do this? Or once I give this to you, what are you doing with it?
Well, thank you. Today we have joining us Eric Gonzalez, who's a VP of Business Intelligence and Data Architecture at Eastern Bank. He's got over 10 years of experience and has been doing advisory work through his firm Omnificity for small startup companies all the way up to Fortune 500 companies. And we're just so blessed and have a great opportunity to have you on here. And so thank you, Eric, for joining us today.
Well, Ian, appreciate you having me. Looking forward to the conversation. And, I think that what you're doing shows the power of LinkedIn. You reached out to me on LinkedIn. We had a couple conversations and now here we are. So thank you.
Yeah, and just from our previous conversations, I mean, it's just been kind of a lightning effect of just branching out everywhere. And so what's fun with this is that I think we're doing this a whole lot more freeform. And so I think the overarching topic that we kind of wanted to address was just like how to build a pragmatic data foundation. I know we've kind of gone almost everywhere in several different conversations, but if you wouldn't mind just kind of telling us and the audience what that looks like to you and how you've accomplished that and built that out in some of the places you've been at.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's always a work in progress everywhere that you're at. And I think it's a very important topic to discuss and something that I'm passionate about in the age of AI. I think people are starting to realize that without having the ROI from these proof of concepts that they started to deploy or develop, now the business is coming to them and saying, where's this value that you told me that this would create? Or how did I spend $100,000 or $10 million on this product or these consultants that came in and now there's nothing to show for it? And, AI, data, all of it is a tool. And so if you think
so you're
about
saying
data,
like progress versus project, right? And give an account for it.
Exactly. And like the example I always give is with AI, if you think about it as a layer above your data foundation, how is it different from when people were talking about blockchain and crypto? How is it different from AI before generative AI when it was more deterministic or still is deterministic if those are the models that you use? How is it different from when people talked about data science early on or data engineering or even just analytics in general? So if you have crummy data and a rocky foundation, putting something on top of it that is going to be predictive or prescriptive for your organization or descriptive for your organization is you showing or highlighting how bad your data quality is and how bad your data foundation is. And so I think the prime example is a actual house. Like if you just put up a bunch of walls and a bunch of just paint and fixtures, but you have zero foundation, the moment there's any sort of weather effect to test that house, it's going to crumble into a million pieces. And I think that's what we see within the industry is people starting to build these POCs, realizing that they're very narrow because their data are siloed and not integrated well and not curated in a way that they have a good understanding of it. Or maybe you had some of that and you built this AI stuff, but you have operations teams and business stakeholders who don't know how to or don't want to use it within their workflow. So now you have a shiny object that's really expensive, but it's essentially a heavy digital paperweight that nobody can use. And so I think just shifting the conversation with whoever you're working with towards what are we going to do with our data? Do we understand our organization today? Are there processes that are enabled by our data, and do we measure and manage them based off of our findings from our data? And just anchoring towards that. And once you've answered and fixed for that, then you can start to build on top of it and say, all right, we have a good enough data foundation. Now we can take this one or two use cases that we've have a good solid understanding of and build AI on top of it.
How do you ferret out like what those use cases are, right? Because we know that like cleansing data, you can legitimately just spend almost all your time doing that, but you want to be targeted and specific and in identifying that foundation, right? So like if you just go out carte blanche and just saying we're going to resolve every phone number issue, right? Like, okay,
Yeah.
well, why? How do you identify those use cases, those places where it's going to have the largest value and effect, and establishing and firming up that foundation?
So there were projects early on that I had where you use like Pareto principles of where can you find 20% of whatever it is, whatever cohort or group, and try to find the 20% that drives 80% of the cost or 80% of the revenue or whatever that is.
Right,
And so there's a project, my first consulting project was around identifying case management cohorts that we could have more of a targeted outreach or approach for. And what we did was we ranked everyone based off of their episodic treatment groups, which is essentially a bundle of ICD-10 codes to say whether somebody falls into like diabetes or asthma or hypertension or cancer, traumatic brain injury. There was just like a variety of these different episodic treatment groups, and then from that, we were able to say whether the chronic conditions that were within each of them were one or two people that had really bad, adverse, acute instances of something gone awry, where you can't really make a big impact on that person's life, or like it was such a extreme event that there's not really much that you can do, or you realize that with maybe an entire diabetes cohort that all of these people within this cohort are not adhering to their RX prescriptions or not even going to
right,
their PCP, and because of that they're not taking their insulin, and because they're not taking their insulin, their A1C tests are through the roof, and since they're through the roof, eventually they get amputations, and when they get amputations then their entire life changes, and now they have even worse health outcomes because of the fact that they just didn't
right.
go into a primary care provider and get the medicine that they needed in order to have a better quality of life. And so if you then extrapolate that towards, okay, now we understand who these patients are. We understand where we can make the biggest impact with our limited resources in terms of the case managers that we have or the medical management staff that we have. Now we can figure out, all right, we know that diabetes is a huge issue. How can we leverage what we understand about this population to predict earlier diabetes within other sets of populations based off of trends that we might see within their emergency department claims or within their
So
PCP claims, so that then we can find and engage those members before they even get to the point of having diabetes identified, or at least a late stage diabetes identified.
So you identified that Pareto principle. You basically said that in this instance, diabetes is going to have the 80% value for 20% of the population. Um, but how much of that was just raw? Like, we're going to start within the data team and the BI team, and do the analysis to determine that that's where the Pareto principle is, and how much of that is like in concert with working with the business and the organization to find, hey, here's where we're identifying some of the highest costs and we need you to evaluate where we can shore that up. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, where is
Yeah.
that balance of like self-discovery within the BI and the analysis side, and then also the cooperation with the business, and the business is saying, hey, look, we know there's some bones in there, go see if there's anything of value.
Yeah. Well, I think it becomes a question of, do you drive your data or does your data drive you? And a lot of times people are trying to find data that fit their story rather
Right,
than taking more of a scientific approach to saying, we have a hypothesis, go test it. And so in this instance, before I got on that project, some of the people that were there were working with the chief medical officer at the time. And she said, hey, we know that adverse maternal outcomes is a huge issue here. So we need to go find that. And we need to go find all of the adverse maternal outcomes that are within here and treat those women so that we can
right.
prevent that from happening, because we know that's a huge issue. But the knowing part was just anecdotal evidence from a few
Perfect. Yeah.
conversations. So as
Yeah.
we
So
got in,
no. So I'm following. So it is like the business says, hey, we know there's value there. We know that there's a skeleton in this closet. We don't know how big. We don't know how small. We don't know the details. Investigate. And I think to an example of that, I had one of the first places I was working at doing BI. The head of tax comes down to me and he says, hey, can you we don't have reseller tax permits on a bunch of these customers. can you go and evaluate how many of those tax certificates we have? We have them in a bunch of filing cabinets, but we don't have them in the system that we actually didn't use for filing some amendments, right? Well, so as I do that, we basically hire a temp and they scan everything into the system, right? We end up finding, I think it was like what in one state for 1 year, it was 9 million in amended returns, right? Aside from like other states and other things like that. And that was just from reseller tax permits, right? And it was just like, go look. We know there's something that might be there. I believe I was even promised like for every $10,000 I find, I get a day of vacation. Obviously, it wasn't cleared with HR because they would not have gone for that. But at the end of it, it was like a massive treasure find. But it started with a business saying, we know there's value here. Can you tell us where it is?
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the data is driving, but the business knows where the skeletons are buried, so to speak.
Yeah. And your example, you did find that skeleton and like that smoking gun that people needed
Right.
to focus on, and you probably would have had 9,000 days of PTO or whatever that worked out to. But I think bigger thing is, well, what if they're wrong? And do you actually have the agency to push back against that person who's saying,
Right.
hey, there's value here, go look? And when you
Right.
look, then you realize like that there might be a little bit, but actually when we were uncovering that, these other things reared their ugly head, and
Right.
we should actually focus here. And so in the example I was giving you, like the CMO said, hey, there's a lot of adverse maternal outcomes. We looked and there were 2 or 3 examples, but it was a rare occurrence that happened that wasn't something that was treatable in retrospect, because it
Right.
was just like something that happened, and it's not going to be part of the widespread population where we're like, hey, we can start to influence or nudge behavioral decisions that will instead have patients go towards a PCP or go to an outpatient center to get treatment so that they have the preventative care needed to not end up in the IP or inpatient or ED based off
Right.
of this certain criteria. And so it was through that discovery and through the fact that the COO at the time, who became the CEO, was a huge change agent, where it was like, okay, we looked there, we validated that this isn't the right way to go and rejected our hypothesis, but instead we found 3 or 4 other buried bodies, or
Right.
poor example
Yeah.
here, but
Yeah. Once you started digging, you found more things,
yeah,
and that was that same with that tax reseller tax permit thing. So
yeah,
if I'm like bringing it full circle and making sure I'm understanding you properly, and bringing that pragmatic data foundation, it's kind of discovering and finding and building some of that proper data foundation, that data quality, that data cleansing, and doing that through a Pareto principle and a very like data centric. Here are the places that are creating the most process workflow problems and the highest levels of analytics issues. And so then the follow up question to that then becomes, and I could imagine that the audience is going to logically go here, is, well, then how do you garner the support of the organization and the business to chase those things and to have that latitude to be that? Because oftentimes what ends up happening is the business ends up trying to drive BI and data and saying, hey, look, I need this, I need that, I need this. And so how do you kind of create that pivot where you have the trust to be able to go forward and actually do that investigative analysis to produce that, if that makes sense?
it does. So number one, I don't think that if you are a good data person or tech person, whatever the case may be, I read this one time and it's always stuck with me. Data don't provide answers, they provide clarity. And so you are providing clarity toward the organization off of whatever everybody's working theories are or hypotheses. And it's your job to help them or enable those working theories or reject them for the organization's success over time. So the problem that I see a lot of people fall into is the whole time you're just taking orders and,
Right.
hey, I
I
need you
agree
to
with
build
that.
this
Yeah.
report. I need you to build this dashboard. I need you to do this thing. And you don't then pause to ask, why are we doing this? Is there a better way to do this? Or once I give this to you, what are you doing with it? And
Right.
so I
Yeah.
think if you're a new data leader or data person at an organization, there's two things you can do to get immediate buy-in or at least set the stage for immediate buy-in. Number one, ask for the P&L so you can understand what the overall top line numbers are for revenue and expense at a company. And then the second question is, what are our top 5 or top 10 initiatives that the executive team, senior leadership
Yeah.
team, board, whomever have green lighted for next year? If you take those two pieces of here are the top 10 initiatives at this company, and here's what our expense and revenue was, and you put that in a matrix and maybe funnel the expense and revenue through each of the different business lines or VPs, directors that you have,
Right.
you can start to build out all of the different initiatives or programs as it relates to those top 10 initiatives with how they affect or impact increasing revenue and decreasing expense. And if you do that, then you can apply the Pareto principles, or you can apply the
Yeah, I love it.
like
And that's such a like succinct data strategy of just being able to align with the business goals and leveraging kind of the dollar value analysis of, hey, we only have so much time. There's only so much value and resources that we could put from a data side. And so where is it going to deliver the greatest value, and how is it aligned with these core business objectives and goals?
yeah, because if let's say you were a startup and your entire business model was based off of your retention of customers, so you're trying to prevent
Right.
churn, and that's like
Right.
the biggest initiative going in next year is how we prevent churn. Then you as a data team are going to want to get all of the customer analytics and understand the entire customer journey and
Yep.
work with the marketing team or customer success team or operations team or app dev team to understand when people churn. Do we have the right forms to collect information about why people churn? Do we have the different interactions that they had
Yeah.
with the
Do you have
salespeople coming
telemetry data
in?
or whatever it may be, customer support tickets, things of that nature that kind of, and then run like LLMs or sentiment analyses and build a customer profile based off of that journey. I love it. Right?
Yeah, but even I would say it's even like, let's not even wait for the LLM or for sentiment analysis to come in. Let's build out proper workflows and forms so that we get a better understanding and can
Yeah.
isolate people into like 20 different categories or answers or responses to something to know what they're feeling or how they respond, and then also provide free text. Because a lot of traps that I find people fall into is just, were you satisfied with this? Yes or no? Please provide more
Yeah.
details. And you're like now trying to guess off of this free text form that might be very passionate for some people, or might be 2 or 3 words. And it was like, the service was good. That's it. So trying to create something that's not overbearing, but also at the same time gives you good feedback. But also, like, if you know that your account manager or customer success person is supposed to reach out every month, and you have some that are reaching out twice a month and you have others that are reaching out once a month, and then you realize that people reaching out twice a month have half an hour conversations and the people reaching out once a month are only having 10-minute conversations, like, do you have the right analytics to support your overall call history or workflow of each customer to know, well, the ones who had more support,
Right.
that had shorter time call volumes or longer time call volumes, they ended up staying with us longer compared to the ones that didn't have any of that. So like,
Right. Or starting from top down, right? Saying what are our longest customers, or what are our customers that seem to have the, or sales reps that have seem to have the greatest retention rates, and then kind of starting to plumb downwards and saying, okay, these are the highest. What's the differentiators? Right.
yeah. And I think that approach and what I talked about as well, compared to what I think likely happens at a lot of organizations, which is the CMO or COO or somebody will come in and say, I need a report on churn last month.
That's
Oh,
absolutely right. It's very reactionary, and so then because of that, you end up getting a completely listless, decision void analytics. And it's like, here's your report. And then they're like, well, let's change it and add this column and add this. And you're like, okay. And so it just becomes this like list taking cog as opposed to a true analyst and trying to actually deliver value.
yeah. Because I will always flip it back if somebody asks me for something that's new. and say, what are you going to do with that if I give you the churn report? And they'll be
Yeah.
like, well, I don't know. I just want to see it. Okay. But if you see it in the past, if you've had churn, what are the 3 to 5 next steps that you do after that? Who do you email? What meetings do you set up? How do you operationally put what I give you into action? And if you don't have an answer for that, regardless of your level, then you haven't thought about the analytics in a meaningful enough way to
Right.
evaluate or support building out that use case. If you have, and you can give me those 3 to 5 things, you don't want a churn report. You want to know all of the new customers that have churned this month,
Right.
their phone numbers and emails, so that you can give it to the sales team so that they could follow up and make sure that they could give people a promotion of 50% off for the next 6 months so that we bring them back into the fold. Whatever it is that from a program level that you want to implement where we've seen success. So it's like, how do you map out that operational workflow and support each of these departments and leaders with what they're thinking of the 2 to 3 steps after you give them that report, that model, that result,
Right.
and then work from there in terms of, okay, now that we did that, how do we measure or create experiments around giving people 25% off for 3 months and 50% off for 3 months and
Right.
like 60% off for 1 month, and see who's likely to convert back and what the churn is after the fact with those promotional values.
I think to that point is part of the analytics is saying, where are you going with it? Like, you can't just, it's coming back to them and putting it on them. What operational changes occur? And so then from a data architecture perspective, as you're building that out, you can now, because you've had that conversation you just said, you can start building some of that framework the first time, right? So it's already knowing that this is going to expand. I'm going to want these additional fields. So when I'm doing this this data engineering work or this ETL space, you're able to have those available and ready for your own analytics and research and helping them drive some of those operational changes.
Yeah, the part with that too is just understanding like what's our most valuable data and what are the things that we're trying to incorporate within not just the data architecture, but like my role is more on like the business intelligence architecture side. So how do we model the data appropriately for the different segments or the different customer groups that we're working with, so that we know that that data is specified towards each of those groups or modeled in the appropriate way, as opposed to data architecture just being more of like I would say that's more close to like the application development side as opposed to like the business context portion. But realistically, you're trying at the same time to build out for each of these different groups while also at the same time not creating silos between the groups, because you don't want marketing and sales and operations to have a different definition of what customer is or
Of
what
course.
member is, and you want that all to come from the same place rather than having like shadow IT or shadow data teams developed where one of them is using Tableau and one of them is using Power BI, and this one has created 15 different Excel workbooks that they have in SharePoint off of systems that we already have deployed, while the other ones are just pulling from those systems directly. So you don't really know what's happening under the hood over here. So just trying to architect it in a way that everybody's pulling from the same foundation that is quality, while at the same time their narrative or their story that's developed within their department, even if it's
Right.
different within each of them, you have a solid understanding and lineage of how that ties back to the source.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm much more of a data centralization guy, much like yourself. But, and I think if we were to jump into the whole like decentralization versus centralization conversation. But yes, I agree. I think that having that centralized data source and that ubiquity of data definitions is absolutely critical within an organization. So then when you're pursuing those goals, because all of those business execs and seniors down below them and middle management is going to be now, well, how do we define customer retention? What's a customer, right?
So on the centralization part, I'm interested to hear your take, but I believe strongly in like more of a hybrid approach where you have each of the data teams from a functional domain are all wrapped within the same like leader, if you will. So if we take what I consider the 4 pillars of data, which is data engineering, data science, data architecture, and data engineering, data science, and data analytics. If you think about the analysts, the architects, the engineers, the scientists within each of those, it's having a head of data engineering, head of data science, head of data analytics, head of data architecture that sit on top of each of those positions. But as you go from architecture, which is going to be more about how these systems are integrated, into engineering, out to science or analytics, depending on where you put your use cases, and then into each of the business lines. As you get further away from the systems and more towards the business lines, there is room for federation, but product in theory should be the interface between the data teams or data pods and each of the business units. And then each of the data teams might have understanding or line of sight into the business units, but functionally still have the same enterprise standards or the same ubiquity in terms of how they do things or the processes around things or their career growth. Um, but while at the
Yeah.
same time still being attached to more of the business line.
Yeah, no, I would for the most part agree with that. I think some of the places of variance where I would say with that is just the requirement for decentralization across organizations that are usually like fractionally separated through acquisition or mergers or things of
Mm,
that nature that have like completely distinctive systems, if that makes sense. And so
it
then, so you're gonna have, it's very rare. It all depends on the organization, right? And so like
yeah.
that's first and foremost. I don't want to like say like there's a catch-all for all things, but there's like depending upon the design and structure of the organization and how it's actually operating and the tools that it's using can lend itself more towards decentralization. Um, but it's rare that you end up running into those organizations. And so for the most part, I'm more of a centralization guy. But what I like to do is actually do what I call like allow pioneering and then a foundation establishment. So you have like you allow your data analysts and your data scientists to run, like build your stuff, however you want to structure it, whatever you need to do. Get it done, get adoption with the business. And then you have your data architecture team backfill. And so we're going to take that and we're going to actually architect it in such a way that it's concreted into our centralized system. And so then
Yeah.
it allows that latitude of nimbleness with the analyst, the data science team, but then it allows for a concrete, like holistic, uniformed platform with the architects, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and I think we're in alignment there. Like the going and building it for whatever the business specificity or need is from the analyst and scientist part. I completely agree. I think the flavor I'm giving, which I think you're in complete alignment, is like you're not going to have a different way of pushing code to production, or you're not going to have a
Yes,
different.
that needs to be ubiquitous, whether it's you have a BI team baked within an operations team, and then you have like a data architecture team within the IT department, right? Like
Yep.
it needs to be unanimous. This is how we do code deploy. This is how we actually store things. These are our principles on how we establish asset compliance or whatever it may be. I mean, these are how we do naming conventions. I know
Yep.
that's like very contentious. I've learned to, in my earlier years, I was very like vicious and like, oh, it's got to be this way. And now it's kind of like, it's just got to be it's just got to be the same, right? Like,
Yeah. It's
how we,
whatever works best. But
yeah, it's like as long as everybody's doing it, that's more important than the actual like nomenclature and like the procedural process. Now, granted, I obviously have my opinions as to what I think is going to be more optimal and where things are going to make things easier to find and follow and all that jazz. But at the end of the day, unanimity across the organization is paramount, right?
yeah,
So,
and it's
well,
like, even just to tie the knot on the part that you were saying, even if you're segmented or you're like distinct business units under the same company umbrella through
right,
either mergers, acquisitions, or just strategic alignment, there's like, I almost think about it as like a fractal in math of like f of f of f of x. Like, you can put layers on top of it in terms of like at the enterprise level, you still have a chief data officer or you have somebody like a chief architect that is still setting the enterprise standard of here's how we do
yes,
things. And then you have a divisional CDO for each of these
yep,
different units with their own teams constructed in similar ways, but applications or different interfaces that are only pertinent to that group. But if I went from one business unit to the other, like you said, with the
Right.
nomenclature or the look and feel or just the overall
Yeah, just the
environment.
SOPs of how you deploy and manage data and code, right?
Yep.
So, well, this has been it's thoroughly like always so much fun to just talk to you, and we've done this a couple times, and I look forward to whether either we have it on the podcast or not, just sitting down and talking with you. So, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. I mean, I feel like we kind of went almost everywhere, and I think I kind of assumed we would just because we were going to allow it to be just so organic. But again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, again, I appreciate the time and can't wait to see what you do with this. And yeah, this is great. The closing question I'll have for you: what's a question that you love to ask people that you didn't have a chance to ask me?
Uh, yeah. So one of the things I would love to ask is just how you started your career. Like, how did you even come into data? Because that seems to be different from everybody. And their story, I always love people's stories, and I think that that's to me one of the most fascinating things is like, how did you get to where you are, right? And what advice would you give to the person who might be wanting to follow in your footsteps?
I love that. And I think that you're going to do big things with this. So let's save that for the next one. And that'll be the cliffhanger for this episode.
All right, I love it. Thank you so much, Eric.